Good evening, Valeriy Viktorovich.
Good evening.
Good evening, dear viewers, listeners and guests in the studio. Today is March 9th, 2020. On March 5th, the meeting between Putin and Erdogan took place. Many people asked you to comment on this meeting in general, and in particular on the Syrian president's statement, where he urged the US and Turkey to leave the Syrian territory under the threat of force. On March 5th, Putin and Erdogan announced a ceasefire and joined patrolling in Idlib. But there is no mention of Turkish forces' withdrawal from the Syrian territory. What is the point of this agreement? How would Syria benefit from it?
Syria would benefit greatly. But first things first. The questions are so meaningful, voluminous, and multidimensional that our listeners will have to expand on our answers themselves. We will only show reference points and directions that would need to be fulfilled with information to achieve an understanding of the governance processes in their entirety. 1 week ago, just before negotiations in Moscow, we discussed issues of Turkey. It was in broad brush terms, but it outlined the present position of Turkey and Russia in the world. I then recalled a well-known expression, although, gently speaking, it is not quite right. If God wants to punish someone, he takes away his mind. Well, Erdogan, by confronting Russia and acting that way, really lost his mind. Now we will talk about it in detail. We have talked about Erdogan shouting different ultimatums towards Russia, using aggressive rhetoric against it. I will tell Putin this, I told Putin that. Let him leave ancestral Turkish, to be precise Syrian, but ancestral Turkish territory, and leave Turkey face to face with Syria. Erdogan honestly disbelieved that he was speaking improperly. You can never speak to Russia like that in general, regardless of Russia's condition. Moreover, Russia, under Putin's leadership, is the subject of global politics, and any ultimatum towards Russia just won't fly for a simple reason, that there is a certain consensus among Russian clan cooperative groups regarding Turkey. And if in the 1990s Russia lived according to the principle expressed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Kozyrev, during his conversation with Nixon, that Russia allegedly didn't have its national interests. Mr. Ex-President, please tell us what national interests we should have. Then Erdogan, shouting the ultimatum, leaned on his internal fifth column in Russia. On American lackeys who would support him, his interests, in his plans to use Russia. One of those American lackeys appeared on Solovyov TV show, that is Gafurov, linked to the internet resource Pravda.ru. He was hysterically trying to prove that Russia didn't and couldn't have any national interests, except those of the great Sultan, who will come and bring to his senses silly Putin and give directions what should be done to please Turkey. And then Turkey will tap Russia on the shoulder or take pity on Russia, and so on. That is a glimpse of the Turkish establishment's viewpoint on Russia. Thus, Gafurov, same as his employer Sultan, doesn't understand that Turkey has no resources to put pressure on Russia. Such resources don't exist. Some Turkish political leaders were trying to say, don't forget, Russia, that you have an Islamic part of the population. But who said that the Islamic part of the Russian population had a pro-Turkish attitude? It has not. The Islamic population in Russia has a pro-Russian attitude. And if anything, in contrast to Erdogan, the same Tatarstan understands that without Russia it won't succeed as a state. It just won't. Yes, Tatarstan may turn into a state a la Ukraine. Will people of Tatarstan, not only Tatars, but all people who live on Tatarstan's territory, benefit from that? No. That is why, despite being whatever anti-Russian, local elites understand that without Russia, Tatarstan will cease to exist as a political subject. And accordingly, the support of the Turkish Sultan, as some folks prefer to call Erdogan, will be counterproductive for those elites themselves. In this regard, one issue must be mentioned. During a discussion about the statehood-defining function of Russian people, some say, other nations will be offended. Other nations won't be offended for one simple reason. It is Russian people who created their states that saved their cultures. It is elites who are offended, who are trying to fish in troubled waters on a nationalism wave. It is them who instigate nationalism. Russia doesn't have national problems unless elites create such tension between nations and nationalities on purpose. But how can elites stop doing that if they receive an allowance in US dollars for doing that? They would not. That is how tension is rising. But there is no inherent tension between peoples. That is the essence of the Russian world. When one Cossack settled in some territory, he was bringing the culture of a multinational state, which was saving the culture of a small nation. In principle, Russia was united not by force, but a new cultural formation was introduced into a new territory, passed to that small nation. And accordingly, this small nation, by becoming a part of Russia, was acquiring the right to survive as a nation. One can learn how to deal with issues of nationalism in the book. State is a nation's survival system. But it is just a side note. Let's go back to our main topic. In other words, Erdogan has no power, has no resources, which he could use inside Russia to solve any Turkish problems by means of dictates and ultimatums, because the resources of Erdogan are negligible in full sense of the word. This resource is very limited and insignificant. Remember, Erdogan recently visited Ukraine, and he greeted ceremonial guards of armed thugs of Ukraine by their accepted Nazi slogan, "Glory to Ukraine." Here are my questions. Why would you do that? Do you understand what consequences it entails for you? No, he doesn't understand. Well, he shouted out this slogan, "Glory to Ukraine." What can one do within this marginalized Kiev's gang and these armed thugs of Ukraine. What Armen was waiting for Erdogan back in Turkey? He got Kiev's Rada replica, the most massive scuffle between representatives of different political movements in the Turkish parliament. What manifested itself? A certain part of the political establishment of Turkey understands that Erdogan leads Turkey to a full-scale catastrophe. And this catastrophe will happen sooner and will be more bloody the deeper confrontation between Erdogan and Russia is. They understand that this bloodiness and speeding up Turkish catastrophe have nothing to do with Russia. All of it will be done by Erdogan himself. And different Erdogan's partners will help him to do that. One more time about Erdogan's measure of understanding of the global processes. For example, Erdogan decided to threaten the world. He said, I will send all migrants from the north of Syria to Europe. He confused the year. He could blackmail Europe in 2015. Today's Europe is of completely different quality. Europe has already paid Erdogan. It is irrelevant that Erdogan states the contrary. It is their internal matter. The issue is the following. Back in 2015, all borders were open for migrants. Volunteers were greeting them everywhere. Migrants were provided with the powerful support of different mass media and segments on the internet. Everything was focused on expanding migrants' waves to Europe. Though even then there was some opposition to the migrants' wave. In 2015, Erdogan could say, I can either enhance this flow or lower it. But what is the situation today? Today Europe is categorically against a new wave of migration. In other words, Europe implemented a series of governing measures. Erdogan's threatening with a new migration wave means a head-on collision with EU countries, both political and economical. Europe doesn't need these migrants. So Erdogan brought these migrants to the Greek border by bus. And what? The EU says, no, under no circumstances may migrants cross that border. We shall provide full-scale supportive measures for Greece to block the migrant wave to Europe. Hundreds of millions of euros were allocated, and the delegation, led by Ursula von der Leyen, arrived at the border. NATO said, we must prevent any migrants from entering Europe. But there is an interesting detail. If in Greece Ursula von der Leyen with the delegation visited the border and observed what was taking place there, Turkish special forces and police were forcing migrants to move towards the border, making them crash through the border, get to the Greece territory, and spread throughout the European Union. By the way, Turkish special forces already killed 1 and injured 5 migrants at minimum during this push over the border. No one is waiting for migrants across the border. If a border is closed, then it is closed, and nothing can be done about it. Whereas to survey the border between Turkey and Bulgaria, Ursula von der Leyen just flew over them on a helicopter. Why? Because Erdogan still has a little bit of gut feeling, and he is not keen to anger the European partners, and therefore he decided to try the weakest link, Greece. Erdogan has an old conflict with Greece, so it is an added bonus for him to give Greece a headache, to create a problem with a possible solution in Erdogan's hands. But it won't work out. There is a completely different situation, completely different. Moving on. We have mentioned before that it is better to wait until the West realizes that Turkey is a base of international terrorism and presents a threat to the whole world. It is working out well so far. What happened just prior to the talks in Moscow? Russian Ministry of Defense made two statements. The first one was about Turkish checkpoints being completely integrated with terrorists' positions. And the second one was about an attempt by terrorists in the north of Syria, coordinating with the Turkish military to conduct a chemical attack against civilian population. In fact, Russian Ministry of Defense said directly that irregular units of the Turkish army conducted terrorist activity on the Syrian territory. That was said practically point blank. So the Turkish army entered Syria. What is important here? No matter how you slice it, the economy of any country must be able to support war expenses, as war is a very expensive business. And on the 5th day of the invasion, Turkey already approached NATO. Could you help us with ammunition? We are short of ammo. Our drones are being shot down. We have a problem. Would you protect us? The reply was, firstly, you are the aggressor, not Syrians. Secondly, we take care of Europe foremost. Asia is not a priority. We, of course, so to say, take your side, but you created this situation yourself. In fact, all these events, asking NATO for help and acting in union with terrorist organizations, undermine the stability of Erdogan's regime in the world. Erdogan played himself into a corner. In this regard, there is a very interesting initiative of Iran. Let's discuss this issue without Russia. Let's add Syria to the discussion, and we will find a solution among ourselves. Turkey would gladly support that offer because Turkey has already decided to oppose Russia. But there is a small problem. Iran demonstrated internal weakness and inability to solve tasks of a global level, and all economic ties of Turkey and a source of its political stability are in Russia. Pipeline, nuclear power station, the same tomatoes, and tourism. Iran won't be able to solve these issues. That means it has to be solved with Russia. Another thing, how can Iran solve the problem of Turkish confrontation with Europe? Speaking in terms of interstate relationships, not in terms of Iran being a center of governance concentration, which it only is planned to become, namely a global center supported by Euro-Asian wing of the global elite. To comprehend all this, one has to conduct his own state politics at the level at which it was proposed by Iran. But Erdogan is not able to understand this level of governance. It is just beyond him. Erdogan's coming into power was driven by the following necessity. Turkey was to be stripped of its inner axis of statehood, the army. Any upcoming leader should restore the neo-Ottoman project and maximally weaken the army, because the army was the state-sustaining axis that supported Turkey. Erdogan did exactly that. By destroying the army, he deprived Turkey of its state stability and curtailed its political stability. But he was prompt to do that. According to that, Erdogan faces a problem: how to obtain a power muscle. He appealed to NATO, but got a response: no, no. And what else is happening in the background? You have a war in Turkey. Haven't you heard that there is a coronavirus in the world? Epidemic, pandemic. Even battleships of the US fleet are returned to the docks for quarantine because of coronavirus. Especially those ships that usually patrol in Turkey's region, those ships that have just returned from there. But it throws Turkey under the bus. Moving on, coronavirus as a governing model is very serious. But what is happening with Erdogan himself? All of a sudden, it turns out that Turkey has citizens infected with coronavirus. Moreover, Turks missed it, and the plane with sick people had to be turned around. What does it tell us? It tells us that Turkey can be put under total blockade at any moment. That is Erdogan's real position. He was walking towards Putin. He thought, that is it, I will show Putin his place now. He notably and scornfully greeted Putin. The translation was polite, Mr. President. But Erdogan defiantly and disparagingly addressed Putin as a chief. Okay, you are chief too. Well, what response did Erdogan receive from Putin? In return, he received a well-tempered conversation on the substance. Then Sergey Lavrov walked in and said, "Oh, I really like your tie." But we all remember a tie eater. Lavrov reminded Erdogan that he ought not to go too far in future and be aware who is he speaking to. Who do you think you are? Did you break the protocol? Then don't be offended if you are put in the proper place. You ask to be reminded about a tie yourself. Erdogan is at the edge of collapse. Coronavirus will be used to execute a blockade. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And Erdogan was forced to negotiate. Some voices request to undertake abrupt movements in order to punish somebody, to do something. One needs to understand that any system can develop or even sustain only if its resource base is at least sufficient for opposing environmental pressure. Lack of resources must be compensated by improving governance skills. It is the rule of the sufficiently general theory of governance. Read thick books on cops, so to say. What is the situation in Russia right now? The situation is fairly weak. Russian so-called elites that are in control of the economy are tied up tightly to foreign powers. And that fact doesn't let Russia use the sixth, the lowest priority of governance, to the full. To bring somebody to its senses, Russia can do it only within the framework of our international agreements and compromises with the global elite. In order to proceed, the following situation must occur. Use of force by Russia should appear as the only option, and, at least at some point, this option should be supported by our so-called partners and put on record. If Russia ignores those steps, it would reinforce current anti-Russian sentiments, a total anti-Russian frame of mind. Russia is always at fault. For example, the West is trying to blame Russia for not following the Minsk agreements all the time. But Russia is not a party to that agreement. Maybe the West doesn't know that Russia is not a party to that agreement. The West knows it perfectly well. Maybe the West doesn't know who shells, who violates the agreement, and that there is a regime in Kiev. They know it because the West itself erected Kiev's regime for those specific tasks, which Kiev is executing towards Russia. But the existence of the Minsk agreement lets Russia rub their nose in this diplomatic document now and then and conduct its own politics. That is why Putin records each move, every move. In regards to Erdogan, the moves were recorded in the Sochi agreement of 2018. When Erdogan says, Syrian government took over positions that must be under Turkish control, he gets an answer. Those positions were supposed to be under Turkish control just as long as you were separating good terrorists from bad ones. Have you done it? No. Terrorists attacked the state of Syria. Syria as a state is obligated to establish an order on its own territory. It is Turkey that is on foreign soil. That is why Syria took over the territory. They will establish order there. The end of the story. You can try to do something on the remaining territory. We agree with you. You see? Just keep separating terrorists. That is why this simmering war in Syria is better than a war with multiple subjects of governance involved. Would it be better for Syria if American military regularly reported US Air Force conducted routine airstrikes in Syria? During the attack, so many excavators, so many heavy equipment units, so many vehicles had been destroyed. Americans were destroying the infrastructure of Syria, making it impossible to restore the state. Of course, it is better that the war is now simmering and the USA has been pushed aside. What is happening with Turkey right now? It can be called a hug to death. Approximately as an anaconda coils its prey. With every breath of a prey, squeezing pressure increases. Turkey is in the same situation. Whenever Erdogan acts to the contrary of the agreement, the pressure will be tightening till Turkey leaves Syria completely. Why does it have to be done that way? To discredit the whole Turkish politics and politics of all Turkish allies. Because that is how global politics works. Stalin was obliged to create Polish Anders army, which didn't even fight in Europe in Poland. That army fought in the Middle East for its master's interests. In other words, there are many embedded processes here, and since Russia cannot exclude Turkey from the list of active players, and carrying out a full-scale war in the north of Syria is not in Russia's interests, then we need to decrease the degree of bloodshed to the full. Russia needs that issue within Turkey to be solved politically, as carefully as possible. But for Erdogan, it is a catastrophe anyway. He will lead one way or another to the point where a decision about Turkey's dismembering will be made, similar to the Treaty of Sèvres of 1920. Erdogan pushes for this outcome himself. Let him do it. Every time he would do something, he would be squeezed. Another move, another squeeze. Thus, step by step, we will push him out of Syria and will finally close the issue of getting back Syrian territories, which France unlawfully gave away to Turkey in the 20th century. There are many embedded processes here. Again, it is very briefly. We just touched upon some reference points.
Nevertheless, it took half an hour.